of us come here once a year to do a legal update. So I had this whole thing planned, and then something happened last Friday.
Oh.
So I think that's what you really want to hear about.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you the other stuff too. I won't just talk about the settlement, but that's the most important thing to talk about. So let's just jump right into that. So what actually happened on Friday? Two big things. Okay, so big lawsuits, 23 lawsuits around the country, all got settled, or there's a proposed settlement. Chances are this settlement will be approved. And you know what? Even if it's not approved soon, NAR is going to change the rules anyway. The rules are going to change by mid-July at the latest. Why would they be changing the rules if the settlement's not even going to get approved? First of all, it's going to get approved, inevitably. And second, they want to prevent future lawsuits. They want to prevent people from suing right now. What am I talking about? You know all these lawsuits. These lawsuits are all, 23 of them, I think all but 2 of them are lawsuits by sellers. A couple by buyers, basically suing their realtors saying, I want a refund. I want my commission back. Why on earth would I give you your commission back? Because the whole commission thing was higher, the commission was higher than it should have been because of this whole system you have. The system you have of paying commissions is resulting in higher commissions. So in other words, they actually sued realtors not for breaking the rules. Realtors got sued for following the rules. But the rules are the problem, was the argument. What rule am I talking about? The rule is that commissions are paid, and they've always been this way my whole life, your whole life, where sellers pay the listing agent, and then the listing agent pays the buyer's agent. And the argument in these cases is that system itself is the problem. They're basically saying the way it's set up with this MLS thing, it results in no negotiation over the buyer's agent's commission. So buyer's agents are getting too much. That's the argument. And you know what? The federal government is not neutral. The federal government, the Department of Justice, is on the side of the plaintiffs. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it's the federal government also. So they're pursuing their own investigation. All that is stopped. This settlement ends these lawsuits. You know who it doesn't end the lawsuits on, though? The really big companies. The companies that have $2 billion in revenue in 2022. But RE/MAX, Keller Williams, and Anywhere already settled anyway. And I suspect these other companies, the really big one, Compass, you know, those companies are going to probably join the settlement. They have the option to. But you don't care about that. What you care about is, what are the rule changes? And there are going to be 2 major rule changes. Number 1, buyer-broker contracts are going to become mandatory. Now, this was going to happen anyway. Right now, 18 states require buyer-broker contracts, and there is proposed legislation in pretty much every other state, including California. I mean, if this settlement had never happened, I guarantee you there was going to be a new law effective next January 1st that would have required buyer-broker contracts. That was happening anyway. This settlement is going to accelerate that. So starting sometime in mid-July, you basically aren't going to be able to show a buyer a house without a buyer-broker contract, without some written contract with the buyer. All right, so CAR already has a form. The form has to be tweaked a little bit because of the settlements. All of this will be done in, I would say, a couple months. So you don't have to do anything yet. But at some point this summer, early this summer, it's just going to be an automatic thing. You can't work with a buyer without a contract from the buyer. It's like your whole life you haven't been able to work with a seller without a seller signing a contract. You're not going to be able to work with a buyer without a contract. And of course, there are various options in this contract. It could be a very short-term contract. It could be for a week. It could be limited to this property. It could be a non-exclusive. It could say, okay, buyer, If I show you, if you buy a house through me, you gotta pay me. But if you buy a house through someone else, you don't. Or it could be exclusive. Like your listings are typically exclusive, where you say, a typical listing is exclusive, where you're saying to your seller, if you sell the house to anyone in the next however, you gotta pay me. It doesn't matter if I find the buyer, you find the buyer, I don't care who finds the buyer, we have an exclusive listing. If you sell, I get paid. So an exclusive buyer-broker contract would be the same thing. It would be like, well, if you buy anything, I get paid. I don't care if I find you the house, you find it on your own. You know what I'm saying? Or a non-exclusive one would be, if I find you the house, you pay me. Otherwise, you might have a contract with some other buyer-broker. Which gets to the next big thing. That's big thing number one. This was going to happen anyway. This is nationwide. This is going to happen. Buyer-broker contracts are mandatory. But the second change that's going to happen, the bigger change, is the way buyers agents are going to get paid. So when I say you sign a buyer-broker contract, it's going to say on that contract, buyer agrees to pay you X. That does not mean the buyer is going to write you a check. I'll explain how all this is going to work. In other words, I guess the best way to look at it, I think, is this. Your whole life as a buyer's agent, how did you get paid? You knew, well, 99% of the time your buyer buys a house that's listed in the MLS. So, and the listing agent offered money through the MLS. So all you had to do to get paid was to bring in a deal and close it. If you did that, you didn't have to negotiate with anybody. It was automatic. You got paid. All you had to do was be a member of the MLS, put the deal together. If it closed, you got paid. That's going away. What's going away is listing agents will not be able to communicate through the MLS that they're going to pay you or how much. That does not mean listing agents can't still pay buyer's agents. It's just that they can't put it in the MLS. Well, how else is a listing agent going to tell me that they're going to pay me? Probably on their own website. Not on the MLS, not on Zillow, not on some big thing. But if listing agents want to compensate buyer's agents, they absolutely still can do it. Obviously, you can call up the listing agent. Maybe that's going to be what you start doing. Every single time you have a buyer who wants to buy a house, before you write the offer, you're going to call up the listing agent, or probably just look at their website or their social media. The point is, listing agents can still pay buyer's agents. They just can't communicate that through the MLS. So that's one possibility. One possibility is you get paid the same way you've always gotten paid, which is from the listing agent through escrow. That's one possibility. Second possibility is the listing agent doesn't want to pay, which, by the way, has always been true. Listing agents have never had to put their listing in the MLS if they don't want to. But of course, 99% of the time, the seller wants the listing agent to pay, and that's the way they get interest in the property. So possibility number two is listing agent, you have a buyer and you contact the listing agent or you go on their website and they're not offering what you think you should get. They're offering 1% rather than the 3 or 2.5% you think you should get. Or they're not offering anything. Possibility. Now how do I get paid? Second choice is the seller pays. I mean, isn't it standard practice in contracts that buyers write? They always ask the seller to pay for stuff. The standard offer asks the seller to pay for escrow fee, title fee, NHD fee, CC&Rs. I mean, it's very normal for buyers in the contract to ask the sellers to pay some of their closing costs. It's common. Well, this could be just one more closing cost. In other words, and the contract already allows you to do this. Paragraph 3G3 of today's contract allows you to check a buyer, check a box and say, I want the seller to pay the commission I owe my agent. This might become a lot more common, right? A lot more common. Hold that thought. I'm almost ready for you. This might be a lot more common in the future that sellers, rather than the listing agent, are going to be the one to actually pay the buyer's agent. So that's a possibility. Third possibility, of course, is what if the listing agent doesn't want to pay and the seller doesn't want to pay either? Well, that's why you got a buyer-broker contract. And the buyer-broker contract is going to say, well, the buyer has to pay. I know what you're all thinking. What if the buyer doesn't want to pay? Well, that's when we have a problem. Nobody wants to pay you. You would think that the whole point is people realize you need agents. I mean, buyers need agents more today than they ever have in history. When I started doing this 38 years ago, the purchase contract was 2 pages. Yeah. There were no other forms. The real purpose of an agent was that they are the only ones who had access to the properties, because you had this MLS book. There was no internet. The only way a buyer could find out what houses were for sale was to find the realtor and say, can you look in your book for me? And you'd have a telephone book sized thing listed with all the listings. That's not why they use agents today. Buyers can find a house on their own. There's Zillow, there's Redfin. Why do they use agents? To do the stupid deal, to negotiate, put it together, get it through escrow, an incredibly complicated, difficult, cumbersome, expensive process. Buyers need agents. And it's going to be part of our job to, I think a lot of people already know this, but if you're going to run into situations where for some reason nobody wants to pay the buyer, they think they can do it without an agent, it's going to be an education process. It's going to be a PR process. And people I think are going to figure out, if you try to buy a house without an agent, you have much less chance of getting your offer accepted. If it gets accepted, you have much less chance of closing. And you have a much greater chance of getting sued afterwards. I always tell realtors the best thing you should tell your client is, use me, because if anyone gets sued, it'll be me, not you. A client without an agent, anything goes wrong, they're getting sued. A client with an agent, anything goes wrong, the agent gets sued. Seriously. I've said that for 30 years. Anyway, so the point is, this is a huge change. The first part was coming anyway. Buyer-broker contracts were going to become mandatory anyway. This was going to, CAR supported this. CAR is sponsoring the bill, but every state is doing this. Every state has proposed legislation to make buyer-broker contracts required. So that's a big change, but it was an inevitable change. The second change is the really big one, which is listing agents cannot communicate their offer of compensation through the MLS. That doesn't mean they can't communicate it some other way, and it doesn't mean they can't pay you. But they just, the mechanism. So in other words, it's going to be harder. Up until now, as a buyer's agent, you didn't have to do anything. You had to think about it. You brought the buyer in. If the deal went forward, you got paid. And you know what? There was no negotiation about how much you got paid. The seller and the listing agent determined how much you were getting paid, not your buyer. Now the buyer has a say-so in how much you get paid. Because the first step of this process is going to be your buyer signing this form, and on this form they're going to agree to pay you. Which leads to another question. You may say to yourself, I'm going to go to my buyer, we're going to sign this buyer-broker contract, but to make it easy for them to sign, I'm just going to say, you got to pay me $1,000. And then I'm going to tell them, because I'm going to get my commission somewhere else. Here's an important thing. That's not going to work. Under the settlement, it says you can't get paid more than what the buyer wants to pay you. So in other words, let's say you say to yourself, I want to get 2.5%. Then the buyer on the buyer-broker contract is going to have to say 2.5%. If the buyer just says 1.5%, but then the listing agent's offering you 2.5%, you only get the 1.5%. So you have to put the maximum on the buyer broker contract. Well, what if that happens? What if the buyer broker contract says buyer will pay me 2, but then the listing agent is offering me 2.5? How do I get that extra half? You'll have to amend the buyer broker contract. Hopefully the buyer will go along with that. I think the average buyer will say, oh, you're getting extra, good for you. Hopefully you don't run across the greedy buyer who says, no, you can't get any more than I said you're gonna get. If there's any more money, give it to me.
Right, that's what they'll say.
That'll happen. You can negotiate any way you want. But the point is, unless you do negotiate it, you'd only get the amount you put in the buyer broker contract. All right, you got questions? Yes.
So it currently says any overage paid by someone else.
Right.
You're allowed to keep it.
That's going to change.
Okay, so that's good.
That has to change, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Next question, so do we let the buyers know before, so we're looking at 10 properties, do we let the buyer know, hey, by the way, these are the commissions they're giving out before you show?
We don't know.
We don't know that.
But if you're, but you're on the website, or do you tell them, I have no clue, let's just go wild in the wild and
Right.
crazy?
In other words,
I mean, what are we doing?
that's a great question, because the current form, I don't know if any of you use the buyer broker contract today.
I do.
Okay, so on the current form, she's exactly right. The current form assumes the MLS. So on the current form, you have to do what she said. You have to tell your buyer, if you buy this house, I get this. If you buy this house, I get that. If you buy this house, I get that. Because it's on the MLS.
Fine.
And if it's not on the MLS, does that mean, as she's saying, before I do anything, I gotta contact every single listing agent in Orange County to see what they're offering? No, it's not gonna be like that. You're going to, in other words, what's gonna happen is, you're gonna have this contract with the buyer. Buyer's agreeing to pay you whatever. Then you start looking at properties. At that time, in other words, not on the initial buyer broker contract, but at that time, it's gonna be common sense, you're gonna wanna tell your buyer. In other words, you're gonna figure it out how it's gonna work best. So you're gonna have this conversation with your buyer up front. Are you gonna have this conversation with your buyer up front that, hey, you're promising this, but chances are you're not gonna pay that because blah, blah, blah. And then when it's time to look at properties, they're gonna ask you, okay, if I buy that one, what does that mean? So then sort of on a one-by-one process. In other words, it's a lot more work for the buyer. It's a lot more work and complication to get yourself paid. It's no more simple to get yourself paid. There's a lot you're gonna have to do. It's gonna take time and effort. My thinking is there's gonna be a difficult period of transition, which is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
But at some point, we're all gonna figure out this is the new reality, and chances are they're gonna figure out agents need to get paid. I need an agent, and it's gonna work out. There's gonna be a definite, difficult transition period. Yes?
If we can't post commission on the MLS,
Right.
can Zillow and Redfin?
No. In other words,
Well, they have been.
yeah, they have been now. They have been now.
But if the MLS, they're pulling it from the MLS, but
Yeah.
can they post it somewhere?
This is one of the many questions. Her question is, well, can I just put it on Zillow? One of the many questions that we are still in negotiation on, because the settlement doesn't address some of these things clearly. So the big shot attorneys representing NAR, representing everyone, are still working this out. This has to be worked out. My prediction is you're not going to be able to do it on Zillow either. You're not, because it's very clear in the settlement that you can't set up some alternative similar to the MLS to communicate this. You see, that's the big issue. The big issue of these lawsuits was listing agents should not be the ones who are determining how much the buyer's agent get paid. That should be a negotiation between the buyer and the buyer's agent. That's the whole problem. That's the whole theory of these lawsuits, is that the current system, why is the listing agent and the seller determining how much the other agent is getting paid? Shouldn't that be determined by the buyer who's actually working with that agent? So making it easy for the listing agent to be able to communicate this is not gonna be okay. We're lucky, I mean, as part of the settlement is, it could have been worse. It could have said listing agents can't pay buyer's agents. It doesn't say that. Listing agents can absolutely pay buyer's agents. You just can't use the MLS to communicate that. So, and you're not gonna be able to use Zillow either. It's gonna be social media, your website, it is phone call. The old way, 40 years ago sometime. I mean, in other words, there are gonna be ways for this to happen. Before I get your question, but one more thing. What if you have a listing agent who just doesn't want to, for some reason, pay the buyer's agent? The sellers will be able to communicate on the MLS
What?
that they're willing to pay.
How do they, what?
Calm down. There's probably going to be a new field on the MLS called seller concessions. So in other words, the seller is going to put in the concession box something like, seller is willing to pay buyer's closing costs up to whatever. And we're all going to read that to say, seller is willing to pay the buyer's agent commission up to a certain amount. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, remember I said there's 3 ways to get paid. One is you still get paid by the listing agent. And by the way, how would that work? If you're the buyer's agent and you want to get, so you go on the listing agent's website or you call them up, I got a buyer for your listing, are you cooperating? They'll say, yeah, I'm going to pay you whatever. Well, you're going to have to sign a contract. We have a form for this, the CBC, the cooperating broker. That's going to be a form that's going to be used a lot. So, in other words, you're going to have to put it in writing. And the second possibility is listing agent says, no, I'm not going to pay you, or I'm not going to pay you what you think you should get. Well, then you're going to look in the MLS to see if the seller, because sometimes I'm sure what's going to happen is the listing agent is going to say, I'm only going to pay whatever, and then the seller says, okay, I'll make up the difference. I know you're thinking worst case scenario, neither the seller nor the listing agent wants to pay, which is something we'll have to deal with. Okay, let's see who's next. You were next.
I think you touched on
Yeah.
this already in the last conversation, but I'm a little concerned on putting out what the brokerage is on personal websites.
Yeah.
Because I think that's just going to be ruled the same kind of thing. It's just you're trying to get around it, and there will be lawsuits for that.
Right.
So that, I think a lot of it seems like we don't. It seems like the safest thing is we take, as a listing agent, you take a brokerage for 2.5%, 3%, whatever you take it. Say that's it.
Right.
That's what I have, and hopefully the seller will put out that concession thing, and then that's how I think we're moving forward. It just seems like that's the safest way to do it.
Good point, but I think the settlement does make it pretty clear that listing agents can put it
This
on their.
settlement.
This settlement, yeah.
This settlement.
But I really think this is going to be the end of it.
Yeah.
I don't know, that was the good thing about the settlement is that preserved the right of listing agents to pay buyer's agents. Because that's what they don't like at all.
Right.
They don't think listing agents should even pay the buyer's agent. But that's not what the settlement says. It says listing agent can still pay buyer's agent, you just can't communicate that on MLS.
What is the actual protect the buyer's agent from that commission cheat?
Okay, the point is all negotiable. So by the way the MLS works is when I put on the MLS today, 2.5%, that's a binding commitment. That's non-negotiable. If the buyer brings in the offer, I have to pay them that amount because that's a commitment on the MLS. Whereas if it's on your website or somewhere, no social media, that's not a commitment. It's basically saying, yeah, I'm going to pay whatever, but that you can't hold them to that until you sign a contract. So with the MLS today, that's the contract, that's binding. But in the future, if the listing agent's going to pay, that's going to be, they're going to indicate somewhere what they are willing to pay, but that's not you have to still get them to sign something confirming
So
that.
no matter what.
No verbal promise.
No verbal, no promise like that. So it's just like on the MLS, you'll sometimes see the seller say, refrigerators included.
Exactly.
That's not a commitment. You have to write it into the offer, I want the refrigerator, and the seller could always change their mind. No, I changed my mind, I don't wanna do that. So you can imagine a listing agent putting on their website, hey, I'll pay you whatever, and then you actually try to get them right, say, no, I changed my mind, I'm not offering that much. So it's not a commitment, but hopefully most agents will follow through on this. Let's go over here, yeah.
Question, if you're using someone else to show a property, because you're, like, they use a third-party service called Show Me, sometimes when I'm not there.
Yeah.
Do they have to, how does that,
Yeah, I
how
know.
does that work?
I don't particularly like that whole process of getting someone,
I mean, you're out of town and.
I know,
Yeah.
but I would get someone in your company to do it rather than this third party. Because, forget the settlement, I think that whole model is being challenged anyway. But the point is, yeah, to show a property, you're gonna have to have a contract. To show a property, that's the key thing. To show a property, you'll need a buyer broker contract. Let me talk about open houses in a second. Brace yourselves. Yes, sir.
The last time you came to talk to us, there were already changes, and you came to talk to us about the fact that buyer's agent commissions now needed to be posted in the MLS, and that's why the woman's asking the question about Zillow was once they were in the MLS, they were then posted on
Right.
portal sites.
Right.
Nothing has really changed. Sellers can still pay commissions. Buyers can still negotiate commissions with the buyers. Both sides are negotiable. It's always
Right.
been that way. The only thing you can't do now is put it in the MLS.
Right.
Which, why don't they just change it to a field that says seller willing to pay a commission?
It's gonna be something like that, except it's not, the settlement says you can't say it's commission. So it's gonna say just sellers concessions for closing costs, and we're all gonna read between the lines.
So.
We're all gonna read between the lines of this,
So what you're saying today, though, is that there's a lot more work on the part of a buyer's agent to figure out how and if he's gonna get paid.
Yeah.
Between negotiating a buyer's agent contract and calling back and
Yeah.
forth, what it tells me is, God, I don't really wanna be a buyer's agent anymore, because there's a heck of a lot more work involved. I might as well concentrate on being the listing agent, I don't have to negotiate anything.
Right. I mean-
And in the end, that commission was negotiated by the seller, and the seller knew he was gonna pay a buyer's
Yeah.
agent commission. And we always had the ability to have a buyer's agent contract, which negotiated with the buyer, so the buyer knew what he was paying.
Right.
But nothing really has changed other than we all paid out $400-something million to say, can't put it in an MLS.
Ultimately, that's right. I mean, but I think we should try to not, okay. You're all trying to work around it so it's sort of like it is now. The point is, I think it's different. I mean, the whole, what they're trying to get at here, what these lawsuits and what the federal government is trying to get at is buyers should have a say-so.
They always have it.
But they have, but in the real world, they haven't. You tell me, how many buyers that you've ever had in your life have tried to negotiate the commission that you're getting? They don't. They basically say, sometimes they don't even think you get paid. They think, it's a wonderful service, they're showing me houses for free. Or they know you're getting paid, but since they're not writing a check, they don't care. You don't talk about it. I know this. You do not traditionally talk about with your buyer as to how much money you're gonna get paid in this deal. You have not done that. And that's what they want you to do. They want you to talk to the buyer. Because here's what they're really thinking. When I say they, I mean the government and the plaintiffs and the courts. They think a buyer should be able to or if you're a brand new agent, you can go to a buyer and say, listen, I'm brand new, so I'm not gonna charge you 2.5%, 3%. But work with me, I'll really try hard, and you only have to pay me 1 or 1.5. They want buyers to be able to well, this agent at this company is so good, I'm gonna pay her the full whatever, or like a listing agent. Just like a listing agent. I mean, in other words, the problem that they see is every buyer's agent gets the same now. So if you put a listing in the MLS and you offer 2.5%, that means agent who's an awesome agent with 40 years of experience writes the offer, they get that amount. Or brand new agent got his license yesterday, doesn't really know what he's doing, but he's the cousin of the buyer. So the buyer is using him, and he gets paid the same 2.5%, 3%. Maybe the buyer should be able to say, well, if I'm gonna use you, you're not getting paid as much as that really experienced person at Remax Terrasol. So that's what is behind all this. They're saying buyer's agent's commission shouldn't be the same every deal. Buyers should have a say-so in negotiating how much their representative gets paid. Of course, we're all concerned that this is gonna result in lower commissions. And it doesn't have to. I think agents in a country like this are really good. You're gonna just have to sell your services. So I'm not just nobody. I'm an experienced, really good agent. In fact, ask for more. I want 4%. I'm really good. You need me. This is hard to buy houses out there. You need me. So I want this. Yeah.
For the most part, I'm a listing agent, and buyers usually text me all the time. So if the buyer is to say, hey, what's the commission in the text, I'm not not knowing the text or dollar.
Right.
But if someone communication, I say it's 3%.
Right.
Sends me your business card. Hold up, that'd be good enough for me to use it.
In other words, I think what you're getting at, another concern, of course, you all have is buyers. Some buyers are going to just try to say, I don't need an agent. Or they're going to contact the listing agent directly. Which, of course, they could do now anyway. Dual agency is perfectly legal. But you know what they're going to say is, I want you to help me, but I'm not paying you. Heavens, no. In other words, the worst case scenario you can imagine is you and your seller negotiate a listing commission. And the seller says, well, since you don't have to pay the buyer's agent anymore, I'm not going to pay you 5 or 6, I'm going to pay you 3. Because I know you don't need the extra money to pay the buyer's agent. So then the buyer calls you up directly and says, hey, I understand I don't need an agent anymore, so I want you to do this deal for me. So your response is going to be, you want me to be your agent? Okay, then sign this and pay me 2.5%, 3%. Buyer says, oh no, I'm not going to pay you. Heavens no. I just want you to do it for free. And you're going to respond to that. You're going to say, I don't work for free. I don't represent both sides for half of what I used to. I mean, it's all going to be an education and negotiation process. Because, I mean, you're just communicating. You're not committing.
Right.
If you text back and forth things like that, until you put it in writing on a contract, you're not buying it. No one's bound to anything. We're all going to have to get used to this.
Right.
Okay? Yes.
So, do I understand you correct?
I had my hand up a lot.
All right, you did. You're right. You did. She did. I already talked to you once, so we'll go over first. I don't care. No, seriously, you should go first.
Okay, so here's my problem with this. I think you just hit on it. It's
Yeah.
a good way to segue in. Buyers are gonna call the listing agent. We're gonna have a heck of a lot more dual agency going on at this point. And now we're gonna have a heck more lawsuits going on at this point, because we've got all these people trying to get paid something. And the listing agents are gonna do it for 4%, represent both sides, and now we're back to dual agency problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's ongoing, which some people say, well, maybe we should get rid of dual agency. Do you want that? No, you don't want to be prohibited from selling your own listing, do you?
Well, I typically don't for that exact reason.
But as an industry,
Yeah.
I mean, let me tell you, if a majority of realtors in this state got together and said, let's ban dual agency, we could make that happen.
Okay, what about first-time buyers?
Yeah.
What first-time buyers has an extra $21,000?
I mean, don't argue with me about the merits of this thing. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the biggest problem is first-time buyers, FHA buyers, VA buyers. First of all, government loans, they're not even allowed to compensate their agent. And the first-time buyers especially barely have the money for the down payment.
Right.
There are other things going on here. Such as working with the lending industry so this could just be financed. Working with FHA and VA to change the rules. I mean, this is an ongoing process. We have to make the government figure out that, did you really want to kill buyers? How is this? Their thinking is, the thinking of the government and the plaintiffs and the courts is, this is going to reduce commissions, meaning houses are gonna be cheaper and that's a good
That was my
thing.
question.
Don't argue with me, I mean, that's what they're saying. You and I know better. You and I know better. But it's an ongoing, this is not finalized yet. But even though it's not finalized yet, these two things are going to happen. NAR is gonna implement these changes before the settlement is approved. This is going to happen. Could be a lot of tweaks to all this, but the two fundamental things are going to happen. Buyer broker contracts are going to be mandatory, and number two, the MLS will no longer be able to be the communications vehicle where the listing agent says how much they're willing to pay the buyer. Those two things are going to happen, and we've got to make sure that everyone understands. I mean, there are a lot of PR things that have to be done, a lot of education has to be done, and really, the government, when they realize they know what they're doing, I mean, I don't think they consciously understand how this is going to hurt first-time buyers. It's going to hurt low-income buyers, and so things have to be done to make it work. And the lending industry, they make their money making loans on real estate. They're going to come out with a way to. Are they going to just stop making loans and go bankrupt? No, lenders are going to figure this out too. It's going to be figured out. There's going to be a difficult transition period. You know who's going to survive? The good agents, like you guys who work for companies like this. Maybe some of the riffraff agents will go away because they can't convince a buyer to sign a buyer broker contract because they have no experience. I don't know. There's all sorts of possibilities. I'm going to get everybody. You're next to it.
This is more of a comment.
Yeah.
Is when a seller knows he doesn't have to pay
Right.
for a buyer's agent.
Right.
But he's still gonna want the going rate of housing.
Yeah.
There is a chance that housing might decline because people
Right.
are offering less,
Right.
right? And then the whole travesty, like you mentioned, that the buyers don't have the money to pay for their buyer's
Right.
agent. So in some ways we could, as you said, expect a lot of turbulence here.
Yes, the turbulence is a good word. Turbulence is going to happen. I'm taking turns. Sir in the back.
Well, I guess, the point that she just mentioned, if the amount of buyers that are able to buy a seller's home is reduced by not providing a commission,
Right.
wouldn't the seller continue to pay a commission in order to have the most amount of buyers who want to buy their home at the best
Right.
price?
Right.
But I think, I'm gonna change the
Yeah,
subject
yeah.
for a second here. We're not talking about the fact that listings don't have to go to the MLS anymore.
Right.
That's a big advantage to bigger shops. Because now, I have a listing here, I'm not a realtor, but I'm a lender, but I have a real listing here at RE/MAX. I don't have to put it in the MLS. Working with me at RE/MAX, I have access to our internal listing database, which has an extensive amount of properties that aren't part of the MLS.
I mean, another question is, what's going to happen with MLSs?
You don't have to be-
Are people going to start thinking, why do I even need the MLS?
Right.
Things are happening,
That
you
means we're
know.
going backward though.
Yeah, I mean, anyway. Yes, sir.
So all these unintended consequences that we haven't even realized.
Right.
When's the next update gonna come out? Next July, for the next version? Because they're gonna have to come out with changes.
See, what's going to happen is, he's just sort of asking the timing of all this. What's happening is, okay, NAR sets the rules for the MLS. But you may ask that question, why? Why can't MLSs do what they want? Because, and you know the real reason for this? I bet none of you know. NAR provides the E&O insurance for every MLS. No MLS in this country is going to do business without the NAR guarantee of insurance, which is why the MLSs are going to follow the NAR rules. They're just going to. If MLSs are going to survive at all, they're always going. So NAR does set the rules. Not CAR, NAR sets the rules. And NAR is going to change some of these rules no matter what. Because NAR is saying right now, well, if we don't change these rules, what's to stop someone from suing us today or next month? I mean, the settlement gets rid of the existing lawsuits, but it doesn't prevent future lawsuits. So they're saying, we better change these rules to prevent people from suing us in the future. The settlement gets rid of the old cases. So the rules are going to change. The attorneys who represent these big companies, and these are the best antitrust lawyers in the country, have concluded that this is, especially since the Department of, even if these lawsuits went away and there was no settlement, the Department of Justice could come in and go after you. So the rules are going to change. Yes, there's issues about exactly how is this all going to work with first-time buyers and FHA and VA and the lending industry. All that's going to be worked out. But the two fundamental things that I'm saying, get used to that. That is not changed. That is going to happen. There are tweaks about it. I haven't talked about open houses yet. Wait till I talk about that. All right, people who haven't talked to me yet. Yes.
I just had a question in regards to, so now I'm going and I'm taking the listing.
Right.
I assume the listing agreement's gonna change to make arrangements to, you're gonna pay the commission, your broker's gonna pay the commission, we're paying no buyer's rate. What do we need to be doing once that happens from a listing?
Yeah. Well, right now on your listing, as you probably are aware, there's a little paragraph where on the listing contract, you and the seller agree on how much you're gonna offer in the MLS. Since you're not gonna have an MLS offer anymore, it's gonna be tweaked to say, how much do you wanna offer the buyer's agent, period, outside the MLS. So point number, if you didn't realize this, today and going forward, you and the seller are gonna have this conversation because it's a joint decision. You as the listing agent have to say to your seller, okay, you're gonna pay me X. Is it okay if I offer some of that to the buyer? And you're gonna have this conversation, you're gonna convince them why that's a good idea. And it is a good idea. We all know that that's a way to get a lot of buyers, and you're probably gonna get more money that way because you're gonna get more buyers, better buyers, buyers agents who want, buyers who wanna buy the house, but if they want an agent, but they can't afford the agent, so if you're not paying them, then they may not buy the house. In other words, it's gonna be a conversation like you should have been having now, maybe you do or don't, with your seller as to how much, you're gonna jointly agree, how much do you think we should offer buyer's agents? It's in our interest to offer buyer's agents money. How much do you think we should offer? I mean, some sellers are gonna say, I heard I don't have to offer anything, I don't want you to offer anything. And they're gonna say, of course, so I'm not gonna pay you 6%, I'm gonna pay you 3%. I'm gonna save money because since you don't have to pay the buyer's agent, I'm not authorizing you to pay the buyer's agent, and I'm gonna save money because I'm gonna pay you a lesser commission. I mean, that's obviously the worst case scenario there. So that's part of your process is gonna be more work for listing agents too, and convincing your sellers, no, I think you still need to pay me 5 so that I can pay the other agent whatever, because that's in your interest. It's not just in their interest, it's in your interest to get more buyers and ultimately sell for more money if we they may say, no, I don't go for that. Well, then you're gonna say, well, the buyer will probably ask you then, if you don't want me to pay them, then the buyer is just gonna ask, you wanna pay me 3% and not pay the extra 2.5%? Okay, the buyer's gonna write in their offer, seller to pay the 2.5% I owe my agent. And then the seller says, I'm not gonna pay that either. I'm just gonna save that money. Well, maybe you're not gonna get as many buyers as you thought you're gonna get. Maybe you're not gonna get any buyers. You know what I mean? I mean, it's
sounds like the same objection handling that you have already.
yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, the government doesn't understand this, the value of the buyer's agent. I mean, I think you should get paid more than, and I'm not just saying this to get you to be happy. I mean, I know how complicated it is to buy a house now. It gets more and more complicated every day. Agents should be getting more money, not less money. We'll see how it all shakes out. Okay, people who haven't talked to me yet. No, you already did. Yes?
A two-part question. Is it gonna be mandated and will it be a buyer broker group?
Yeah.
And will it be something that we have to show the listing agent when we use it?
Well, not necessarily. The question is, yes, the buyer broker accounting is going to be mandatory, but do I have to show it to the listing agent?
Is it mandated? Who's gonna watch that we do it?
Oh, that's a great question. But who watches you do anything? Who
Gary.
makes sure you? I mean, who makes sure that you give the buyer an agency disclosure form? I mean, if you don't follow the rules, someone can sue you. I mean, obviously. So there's, or the DRE. You know, the DRE is going to enforce this. Yeah.
I just want to remind everybody that in CoStar, they operate in the same manner. They don't list in CoStar the compensation for the buyer's agent. So you have to go and do your due diligence and.
What's CoStar?
CoStar is commercial real estate.
Oh,
So for those of you that are working in that space, but they don't publish their compensation to the buyer's broker agent. You have to call the agent, and with your offer, you send over your LOI, your letter of intent, asking for what your commission is going to be, and then that's how you're compensated along with your offer. So that's already been going on for years and years and years. We're just now adapting to this new format on the residential side. So.
That's a good way to put it. Yes.
So what's to prevent somebody from making a website that you just go to and then you put the property address in and you put the commission in there? It's
Yeah.
not the MLS.
See, the settlement says everyone agrees not that you're not going to set up a similar structure to the. You're not going to set up this big structure, just an alternative way to communicate this, because they know realtors are going to try to come up with workarounds to make sure things don't really change, and that's not what the settlement says. In other words, I think we should be happy that at least the settlement says you can still advertise it on your website. I know you're even concerned about that. But no, there's not going to be an alternative Zillow or anything that makes it easy. This is not going to be easy anymore to get paid as a buyer's agent. You're going to have to do a process. First, your buyer, you're going to have to talk to your buyer and come up with a number where they think you're worth. And once you have that number, if you want to get someone to pay that other than your buyer, you have work to do. Go to the listing agent, negotiate with them, or explain to the buyer how you can ask the seller to pay for that. So there's no going to be an easy, simple alternative website, Zillow. It's not going to be like it is today. It's going to change. Yes, sir.
You know, we're kind of prepped for this when we had the COVID thing, because we had to go and get COVID.
Right.
Before you showed a buyer property on every property.
Right.
So we're kind of back on the
Right.
CBC in a way, we're already prepped for it.
Yeah, I mean, we've been through COVID. I think is going to be difficult, a more difficult situation than this. I'll get your questions, but let me talk about one more thing. Here I think are the two biggest immediate issues. Number one is, okay, these new rules haven't kicked in yet, but what do I do today? I mean, I would say on the buyer side, sooner the better, get used to trying to do buyer broker contracts. But we're going to have to come up with very quickly some type of little disclosure or something that you're going to have to give to your clients today. Something along the lines of, okay, yeah, list with me today. We're under the old rules. But I'm just giving you a heads up that rules are going to change in a couple months. Because if you don't do that, I can imagine this happening. You do a normal listing today like you've always done, then seller reads somewhere that if I'd waited until July, I would have been able to do it differently. You should have told me that back in March, when I would have waited till July to do this. So we're pretty quickly, if not very quickly, we're going to have a new recommended something that you're going to give your current clients, at least explaining the rules are going to change so they can't sue you later for saying you should have told me that, I would have waited, or blah blah blah, because that's what they'll do. So that's an important thing. The second real important thing is open houses. I don't know if you guys do them or not. So the settlement says you can't show someone a property without a buyer broker contract. So I'm a listing agent sitting at my open house, and strangers from the just walking in all day long. They're just strolling in without an agent. Oh, can I walk around? And the question is, every single person who comes in the open house, do you have to make them sign a contract first? The settlement is unclear. So we are working feverishly with the judge and everyone who's putting together the settlement says that needs to be clarified. I mean, but let's think about it today. Forget everything new. Today, when you're sitting at an open house and someone comes in and they want to look at it, do you normally let them wander around by themselves, or do you walk them through it like on a normal showing? You tell me.
Depends on how many people are in.
It depends on how busy it is, right? Because it could be argued that even today, when you got an open house and it's not very busy and someone comes in and they don't just want to walk around on their own, they want you to walk around and explain to them. Arguably, today that creates an agency relationship. And some of you, I don't think of it that way. You think, well, this is not a normal showing. I know when I show a buyer a house on an appointment, that's obviously they're my client. But I'm just doing an open house, showing them around the open house. That's not really showing them. So I don't have to worry about giving them the agency disclosure form and doing all that stuff, which has always sort of bothered me because gray area there. So maybe this is going to be clarified. I would not be surprised, by the way, if this is what happens. There's going to be your normal buyer-broker contract that we're all talking about, we already have, and then there's going to be an open house showing form.
And I'm sorry, what?
There's going to be an open house form, which is going to basically say to someone when they come in the open house, yeah, I'll show you around, but I'm not your agent. You understand that I'm not your agent. This is not like a regular showing. Because if this was a regular showing, I'd have to give you an agency disclosure form. I'd have to, do this. You don't have to, but you would recommend it. So there may be officially in writing 2 different types of showing. The normal showing and the open house showing. This is being worked out as we speak because this has not been resolved. To me, that's the biggest open-ended question. Because some people are reading the settlement to say every single person who comes into an open house has to sign a buyer-broker contract. I don't think that's the way it's going to be, but it's not clear yet. So, all right, yeah.
What if an agent, you see this once in a while, says, I will not pay you unless you belong to the NLS?
So on the listing side or the buyer side, whatever. I mean, theoretically, of course, what is the MLS going to be now if it's not a place to offer compensation? It's going to be an advertising medium for the property. What if some of your client says, I don't know if RE/MAX, this office, if you're going to have a position on joining the MLS or not. Nobody has to join the MLS, but it's perfectly, I can see a client saying, well, you got to join the MLS. I like the MLS. I mean, it's all negotiable. It's all negotiable. You don't have to, in other words, you have to join NAR, by the way. People have another question. People say, I want to quit NAR. You can. Well, first of all, that's not your decision. That's your broker's decision. The broker can say, if you want to work for me, you got to join. But the other thing is, if you don't work, you can't quit NAR without quitting CAR and the local one. And CAR is the one that gives you the free forms and the free hotline. So me, they give you me. So if you quit all of that, you'd have to buy the forms on your own, which is $1,500 a year, which is more than you pay for everything else anyway. Anyway, just something to think about. We're getting that question now. I hate NAR. NAR threw us under the bus here. NAR did the terrible thing, so I don't want to be with NAR. CAR is good. Well, you can't do it that way. It's all or nothing. Yeah.
Is there a verbiage that we can use right now on the current listing agreement? I have 2 listings, and I've just been waiting for this particular meeting before doing it, and they're being rehabbed, so they're not even ready until July. What is the verbiage that I need to put on?
We don't have it yet. I mean, we're going to have it for you very soon. Well, right now, here's what I would do. On NAR, you remember you've gotten emails from NAR in the last few days.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Print one of them out and give it to your client. That's sufficient. That really, I mean, CAR is going to come up with probably this week our own Q&A. So NAR has sent all of you the NAR FAQs on all this stuff. And it's pretty comprehensive. CAR, who I work for, is gonna come out with our own little Q&A. Actually, we posted something, I think we're gonna post something today, sort of as Q&As on the settlement itself. And then within a few days, we're gonna post a short Q&A on the new changes. But the reason we're not doing that yet is because we still don't know some of the answers to some of these questions. But I think as long as you put your client on notice by giving them the NAR thing or the thing we're posting today, which is just like FAQs about the settlement, that's sufficient. What I'm saying is we're probably also might come up with a form, a short form disclosure. But if you just give them that today, I'm not concerned that you're gonna have a problem. Yeah.
Can you clarify for me, somewhere in your discussion, I heard something about not having to put the listings in the MLS? Is that changing?
Not yet. I mean,
So
right
we still
now.
have the registered listings?
Oh yeah, I mean, nothing has changed as far as the MLS. If you remember the MLS, you gotta do, yeah. I mean, that's gonna be a big decision about, are people gonna leave the MLS? I mean, who knows? That's not my decision anyway. So right now, nothing has changed. All the rules, nothing has changed today.
The big headline all week since the announcement is NAR settles, realtors can no longer charge 6%.
It's so stupid. I mean, the New York Times.
Was there any limitation about how much an agent can charge?
No, I mean, the New York Times should know better. I mean, they put out there, oh, the mandatory 6% commission is gone. It's never been mandatory, and it hasn't been 6% for a long time. I'm just complete nonsense.
But the damage is done because that PR.
And you just have to counter that. It says, it's always been negotiable. Yeah, I mean, it's between me and you, NAR hasn't done the best PR job on all this stuff. Countering all this stuff in the media. I think they're working on it now. They're trying to, but yeah, the media's just terrible on this. They're just wrong on, especially the headlines, like you said, the clickbait. The headlines are I mean, I read every LA Times. They're all wrong. Every media article I read is misleading and wrong. And part of our job is going to be to correct the record.
You said some other states have already adopted this?
Well, they've already adopted mandatory buyer broker contracts.
Okay.
And you know something? In those states, it didn't cause a problem at all. People just moved to that easily. It has not been controversial. I don't think that's the controversial part. The controversial part is, as a buyer's agent now, you have to work harder to make sure you get paid. You didn't have to do anything before. You brought in an offer on an MLS listing, end of story. You got paid. You didn't talk to your buyer about how much you're getting paid. You got paid whatever the listing agent wanted to pay you. And you were typically okay with that. It's changing. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is if you are on contract with the listing agent with the seller and you post the commission, by June or July, the house not sold, what do you do then?
Yeah.
And my other question is, when NAR with the settlement, does that take care of all the states?
Yeah.
And all the future?
Okay, two questions. The first question, I have a listing today. The rules changed and it still hasn't sold yet. Now, first of all, when they say these rules are going to change by mid-July, that's at the latest. It could happen sooner. So the rules change in the middle of my listing, or maybe it's sold but hasn't closed yet, and the rules just change. So that's a fundamental question. Are you going to be grandfathered in under the old rules, or are you going to have to do something since you still haven't sold it or closed it under the old rules and the rules have changed? Does that change your transaction? Another thing we're getting clarified, I mean, that's why the settlement's not finalized. The settlement needs to address these things. My gut reaction is existing deals are going to be grandfathered in under the old rules, and you're not going to have to do anything. But that is a very big thing that's being clarified. I think the two biggest things that are being clarified right now are that and open houses. So both of those are in place. Now, your second question was, I think, about the settlement. Who's under the settlement? The settlement releases from liability. I mean, NAR is paying $400 million. It's not like they got released for free. NAR is paying a lot of money, and they say, and they have to pay it over a 4-year period. And NAR has said no dues increase at least this year. It also releases CAR. It releases OCAR. It releases every local association in the country has to pay nothing. It also releases every agent and broker in the country who works for a company that had less than $2 billion of total sales volume in 2022. RE/MAX settled already. RE/MAX, Keller Williams, Anywhere, done deal. So RE/MAX already was in a position where they weren't going to get sued again. So, and this covers every possible claim back to like 2019, which is the statute of limitations. So this is a clear release of everybody except the big companies who didn't sell. Compass, Berkshire Hathaway, there's a bunch of them. Big nationwide companies that did not sell. And this is also a release of the MLSs. MLSs, associations, and every broker in the country who didn't already settle and has sales volume of less than $2 billion. There are a bunch of big companies out there, Compass being the biggest one, who are not part of this settlement and they haven't settled on their own. They can choose to join the settlement if they want, but they're gonna have to pay some money into the fund. Yeah.
Who's actually getting the money?
The attorneys, of course.
Was it Andrew Florence, the guy from CoStar, may have been behind some of this?
No, I mean, see, these are class actions. A class action means you get these things in the mail.
Yeah.
Hey, if you bought a phone from, T-Mobile 3 years ago, maybe you're eligible to be part of the class action and you get $20. It's not even worth doing. But basically, every seller who sold a house
In Missouri and Illinois.
No, nationwide. Every seller who sold a house nationwide and they used one of these companies can ultimately participate in the settlement, which means they're all gonna get $100, I mean, think of how many people have sold a house in the last 4 years in the USA. Millions. Like I said, they're all gonna get $100. And the attorneys are getting a third of everything, so that's where the money's going. Yeah.
I want to clarify something,
Yeah.
because I read it different than what you just
Okay.
said. Once you have the buyer broker agreement signed, let's just say
Yeah.
2.5%. Every house you go show, do you have to let your client know, hey, by the way, they're only paying once, so you owe whatever? Is that something we need to disclose?
Well, think about it this way. Okay, so I sign a buyer broker contract. You're gonna have this conversation with your buyer. And you're gonna want in the buyer broker contract a big number. Because that's the max, you can't get, without a further negotiation, that's all you're gonna get. So you're gonna have to put in the buyer broker contract what you think you deserve, 2.5%, 3%, whatever. 10%, right. Whatever you think you should get. Then, of course, you're gonna have this conversation with your client, probably. I think you're gonna say, but just because we're agreeing to that, doesn't mean you're gonna cut me a check. I mean, because whatever house you wanna buy, I'm gonna try to get the listing agent to pay that. Failing that, we'll try to get the seller to pay it. So I'm sure they're gonna ask you, before they make an offer on a particular property, okay, if I buy that one, have you asked the listing agent? Have you looked at the MLS to see if the seller's offering? So it's gonna come up every time before buyers make offers, they're gonna wanna know.
So that's when you.
So that's when you're gonna explain all that.
Okay, I just thought you had to every single time, you're like, oh, by the way, here's the door, this is their offering.
I mean, you're probably gonna end up doing that because they're gonna wanna know. You'd think the buyer's gonna be interested in knowing how much, because they wanna know the bottom line, how much am I gonna have to cut you a check for? Right, so they're gonna wanna know all this, yeah,
Okay, so I have a broker agreement, I do it at 3%.
right,
Then I write an offer.
Right.
And I find out, well, with the offer, I can attach the CVC that I want 3%. Especially, yeah, and you.
I would, go ahead, I'd interrupt you first and say, I would get the CBC signed before you write the offer. In other words, if your buyer's interested in a property, well, you guys are gonna figure out what works. You guys are in business, you guys will figure this out. My gut reaction is I go to the listing agent first and say, hey, I got a buyer, will you pay me? And they say yes, so please sign the CBC. If you wanna wait and do it, the problem with doing it with the offer is, the seller says, no, don't sign that, but I'll accept the offer. And then you haven't taken care of your
Can
commission.
you put it somewhere on the RPA that the agent's to be compensated X amount?
Remember, that's your second choice. You got two choices. Choice number one is the CBC, where the listing agent promises to pay you. The other choice is purchase contract asking the seller to pay. Or maybe it'll be partly, maybe the buyer agrees to pay you 3, and you persuade the listing agent to pay you 1.5, and the seller pays you 1.5, or maybe they pay you 1 and the buyer pays you. Who knows how this is all gonna play out?
Okay, so what if we're
Yeah.
like 0.5% short than what the buyer.
Then the buyer pays.
But what if they're first time buyers and they're barely getting
So here's
this house?
another great question is, so you have your first time buyer who says, I can't afford to pay you anything. I said, got it. But you need to put in this 2.5% or something on the buyer broker contract, so I have the leverage to go and get it because I want the money. But then it turns out you can't get that money from the listing agent because they won't pay. Well, then then you're gonna obviously ask your buyer to ask the seller to pay on the offer. And then seller says no. Well, then the buyer says, what does that mean? You say, well, that means you gotta pay me. And the buyer says, I can't. Well, then they're not gonna accept the seller's counteroffer, where the seller's counteroffer is gonna say, I'm not paying you. And the buyer's gonna say, well, what do I do with this counteroffer? It says, well, can you pay me? No. Well, then I guess you can't buy this house. Or hopefully the lenders will finance it. The buyer say, you can't afford it, we can get this financed. It's gonna be part of the loan. This is gonna affect appraisals, this is gonna affect loan to value. Everyone's gonna need to adjust to this. The lending industry, loan to value ratios, the appraisal industry, all of this is gonna have to adjust. It's gonna be a transition period.
Okay, so I'm gonna use this on the listing side. I'm gonna go to my seller and say, this is my commission, I want 3.5, that's what I get paid.
You're saying as a listing
As a
agent?
listing agent, and say, most likely, the buyer's gonna come in asking you to pay either the buyer's commission or 2.5, 2%, 3, whatever it is in seller's concession to go towards buying or closing costs. As a listing agent, it puts us in a good shield because, look I'm getting 3.5. I'm not the one saying you have to pay more. That's the buyer saying that you have to pay more.
I mean, I think.
That's the market.
I think there's a whole education process.
Go, Vision.
You guys are gonna have a lot of work to do. I mean, I'm not, you guys know what you're doing a lot more than I do, but it's gonna be so, I think the message that we need to get out there is real estate works best for everybody when each side has a good agent working for them, a good, well-paid agent working for them. In other words, if I were talking to a seller, I'd say, it's not just in the buyer's interest that we compensate their agent, it's in your interest. Because you're gonna get more buyers, you're gonna get better buyers, and when you get into escrow, you want a good agent on the other side. oh, I'm gonna save money, I'm not gonna offer them, I'm not gonna make them, I'm gonna make, whatever. Yeah, if you think that's gonna result in a better result for you, I don't think it is. I think it's gonna be a better result for you is if the buyer has a good agent and they're getting paid. And maybe this buyer can't afford it. It's probably in your seller's interest. I mean, if you think about it, why all these years have sellers been willing to pay you X amount knowing you're gonna pay the buyer's agent? It works. Because it works. It results in better outcomes for the seller, not just better outcomes for the buyer. Another way to look at it is this, now and in the past and in the future, the buyer's paying everybody anyway. Escrow, NHD, home inspector, anyone in real estate who gets paid anything comes from the buyer's money. They bring money into escrow, and that money is used to pay the listing commission. I mean, sellers, you know, they get paid. You get paid through close of escrow. Seller doesn't come up with the money. They give some of the money that the buyer gave them to you. It's not like the seller came up with their pre-existing fund of money to give you your listing commission. They don't pay you unless they get money from the buyer. It's almost like people don't understand this. The industry has done a bad job of explaining all this and explaining the benefits of agents and the benefits of agents on both sides. And like I said, I think agents should get paid more. It's because it's more difficult now. See, the government they're thinking prices are too high. The reason prices are too high is because agents are getting paid too much. If we cut down agent commissions, sales prices will come down, and that's good. They're not thinking it through.
Yeah, that's a lot.
You mentioned about putting the commission in the RPA or the counteroffer, but right now we can't do that. You can't negotiate.
Okay, we got to make this distinction here. What he said is correct. You cannot negotiate in the purchase contract the commission that the listing agent is paying the buyer's agent. You can negotiate in the RPA how much the seller is paying the buyer's agent. In other words, we've been telling you this forever, going back forever, my whole life. If the listing agent offers in the MLS, let's say 2%, and you want 3%, what's prohibited is the buyer writing in the offer, I want the listing agent to pay my agent more money. That's what you can't do. What you can do, and you've always been able to do, is for the seller to agree to ask the seller to pay the buyer's agent. So you can't use the purchase contract to negotiate with the listing agent. But you can certainly ask the seller, you can ask the seller to pay for anything. Seller, I will buy your house if you buy me a car. You pay for my kids' college education, then I'll buy your house. You can ask the seller for concessions to pay for anything. It's just, and you've always been able to ask the seller to pay the buyer's agent commission. We've never had to do that before because buyer's agents 99% of the time got paid by the listing agent. And that still may end up being true as we get through all this.
New RPA won't have a box.
It already has a box.
They don't have a box.
In other words, it already has a box, right?
Right.
3G3, so that's already there. In other words, the Forms Committee anticipated this whole thing by putting 3G3 in the contract. They were anticipating that this might happen.
The one thing that I'm still stuck on is that buyers are gonna go straight to the sellers because they think that they don't have to pay a buyer's commission if they go to the seller, but the seller's gonna have them sign a buyer's agent agreement that says the buyer is gonna pay a commission. And so all they did was get sidetracked into the seller. Are the associations gonna have any kind of a PR marketing that tells people what this is all about?
I hope so, yeah.
Why having their own agent is of value?
Right, I mean, the problem I know you're gonna run into though, which some people are already running into, is this has always been an issue of listing agents basically saying to their clients, I'll list for 3.5%. And if the buyer comes directly to me, I'll take care of them too. But that's always been possible. Listing agents have always had the ability to encourage the buyer to do a dual agency by saying to their seller, listing agents have done this for years. You say to your seller, the commission is 5%, but if you sell it to one of my buyers, it's 4%. That's called a variable commission. There's a checkbox in the MLS. And that's always been the case. And as long as dual agency is legal, it's always been the case that listing agents can give, and so maybe more than even now, buyers are going to go directly to the listing agent. Who knows? But some buyers already are thinking, oh, this is great. I'm going to go directly to the listing agent, and I'm not going to pay anything. And that's not going to be. I mean, if I were a listing agent, I'm not going to do twice the work for the same, for 3% or 2.5%. So it's going to. I would think the response to the buyer would be, oh, do you want me to represent you? Okay, then sign this contract, pay me 2.5%. So, oh no, I don't want to pay any more money because I don't have to pay it. No, well, you want me to help you as your agent. Well, then buyers will say, okay, I don't need an agent. Have you ever done one of those deals?
Yeah.
Whether you're the listing agent, the buyer doesn't even have an agent, then of course they're going to ask you to help them. Well, could you write the offer for me? I'm not your agent. Well, you have to. No, I don't. I'm not your agent. But then you're going to think to yourself, you're going to tell your seller, there's this idiot out there who wants to write an offer without an agent. And the seller may say, well, maybe at least give them the form, which you would have the right to do. As a realtor, you could give the unrepresented buyer an RPA and let them, I mean, maybe it's in your seller's interest to help this idiot, even though they're not your client. Because we have a form for that. It's called the buyer non-agency agreement. We basically give it to the buyer and say, I'm helping you because my seller wants me to help you, but I'm not your agent. Maybe that's going to be more prevalent as well.
Procuring cause is going to be an issue too.
Procuring cause is gone. Think about this. Think about this. Procuring cause is when the listing agent offers, so today, in your whole life and my whole life, the listing agent puts an offer of compensation in the MLS saying, I'm offering 3%. So then you introduce a buyer to this property, but instead of writing the offer with you, they write it with their cousin who just got his license. You have the right to challenge that and take the cousin to arbitration. And you're basically saying to the panel, the arbitration panel, you're saying, even though the cousin wrote up the offer and got paid 3%, I was the procuring cause because I'm the one who found this property for the buyer. So that money that the cousin got, I should get. So you're basically going after the cousin. You're asking the cousin, you're demanding that the Board of Realtors tells the cousin, give that money to this person. You see, that's never going to happen anymore because there's no offer of compensation. For you to get paid, you're going to have a buyer-broker contract. Now, what if the buyer is dumb enough to sign 2 buyer-broker contracts that are exclusive? They go 2 commissions. Just like a listing agent is dumb enough to sign 2 listings, 2 exclusive listings, they owe 2 listing commissions. Or maybe, I don't know, we'll see how it happens, maybe most of your buyer-broker contracts are going to be non-exclusive. In other words, you have an option on the buyer-broker contract. You have 2 choices, exclusive, non-exclusive. If you check non-exclusive, you're saying to the buyer, if I introduce you to the property that you buy, I get paid. But if you find the property having nothing to do with me, or you have another contract with another buyer's agent and they're the one who finds you the property that you end up buying, they get paid, not me. So we'll see how that works out. Are most buyer-broker contracts going to be exclusive? I mean, I know listings, 99% of listings are exclusive. you guys all do exclusive listings. I don't know how it's gonna be, if it's gonna be the same for buyer broker contracts. But the point is, procuring cause is gone. Because procuring cause is when you're going after the agent who actually wrote the offer, saying, I'm the one who deserves the money. It's not gonna be a question of that, it's gonna be a question of, you're gonna have a contract with the buyer. That's gonna determine if you get paid. And like I said, if the buyer's dumb enough to sign 2 of those that aren't exclusive, then the buyer has to pay 2 people. But you're not gonna go to the board of realtors to make the other agent give you the money that they got. So procuring cause is, I should have got that commission that you got, give it to me. But that's gonna be irrelevant. So you're never gonna say the words procuring cause anymore. Procuring cause is just going away. So that's interesting. Now I can talk about other stuff. I'm in no hurry to leave. If you want a 10-minute version of my normal legal update.
I would, yes.
Okay, let me just tell you, good news is there's not a lot of other stuff happening, but there's stuff you need to know. All right. New laws and forms you should know about. One form, if you haven't noticed, came out in December that's attached to the purchase contract called the Buyer's Insurance Advisory. Have you seen this form? All it does is it tells your buyer insurance is important and it's hard to get. Therefore, think about it early, and you probably shouldn't commit yourself to buy the house until you figured out if you're getting the insurance that you want. So, Buyer Homeowner Insurance Advisory, not a mandatory form, but it is attached to the purchase contract. Okay. That happened in December. Other forms. This month, next week, there's going to be a couple of form changes. One of them deals with rentals. If you guys don't deal with rentals, you don't care about this, but let me tell you anyway. You know we have a form to evict tenants. It's called the Notice of Termination of Tenancy, NTT. I just call it the 30-day notice or the 60-day notice form. And that's the form you tell the tenant they have to leave. Did you know, I think you know this, in California, if you have a rental property that's 2 or more units and it's more than 15 years old, you're under something called California rent control. I mean, LA, where I live, has LA rent control, there's Pasadena rent control, there's Santa Ana rent control, there's San Diego rent control, there's Santa Monica rent control. Right here, there's no rent control. So you say, I don't have to worry about rent control. Yeah, you do. Because everywhere in California, if your rental property is 2 or more units, 15 years old, you have California rent control. Single family homes, you don't worry about it unless you're in a rent control city. So what's the significance of being in California rent control? 2 things. You're limited on how much you can increase the rent, and you can only evict the tenant with just cause. How much can I increase the rent if I have a property that's more than 15 years old, more than 2 or more units? 5% plus inflation. What inflation? The inflation for your county last year with a cap of 10. Does anyone even know the Orange County number? It's 8.8. So you cannot increase the rent more than 8.8% if your rental property is more than 15 years old and 2 or more units. If it's a single family, you can increase as much as you want. If it's a newer building, increase as much as you want. But otherwise, you're limited. But the other big thing is, I got my 20-year-old fourplex, I got a tenant, I want to evict the tenant. I can't just evict them because I feel like evicting them. I need a reason. I need just cause. If they do something wrong, that's easy. They don't pay the rent, that's just cause. They subtenants without permission, pets without permission, whatever. But what if I have a tenant in a 20-year-old building, they're not doing anything wrong, I just want them to leave. By the way, why would you want them to leave? Probably because they're paying 1/3 of the market rate. And if you get a new tenant, you can bring it up to market. But if I keep this tenant, I can only keep increasing it like 8% a year. I'm never gonna catch up. I'd rather get them out, put in a new tenant. How do I do that? There's only 3 ways. Number 1 is you can take the property off the rental market. Do you really want to do that? Because you got to do it for 2 years. So you could actually give the tenant a notice that you have to leave. Why? Because I'm taking the property off the market. But that means you can't re-rent it to anybody for 2 years. Do you hate that tenant enough that you'd rather have the property vacant for 2 years? Maybe. But there are two other ways to get a tenant out. Family move-in and remodel. Those laws are going to change on April 1st. So we have two new addendums to the 60-day notice form. We have the family move-in addendum, if you're evicting them because of a family move-in. We have the substantial remodel addendum, if you're evicting them because of a remodel. So here's what it says. If I got a tenant in my 20-year-old fourplex and I want to kick them out for a family move-in, I have to give them this addendum, and on this addendum it's going to say, you have to leave because this person is moving in. And this person has to be me, my kid, my grandkid, my parent, my grandparent, or my favorite, my spouse. You know, like, nothing personal, honey, but you gotta move into the rental. We gotta get that tenant out of here, you know, I mean, and they gotta stay for at least a year. Trial separation. The point is, it used to be you could move your cousin, nephew, uncle, ex-wife's fifth cousin. I mean, you know, now it's only certain people can justify a family move-in. And there's a new addendum to the notice of termination of tenancy form that's coming out next week because this is effective April 1st. Similarly, what if I don't have a kid to move into the property, so I'm gonna move them out based on doing a substantial remodel? Well, you have to give them the new substantial remodel form, and it basically says on that form, I'm kicking you out because I'm doing a remodel. And you gotta tell them what the remodel is. If it's permit required, you have to actually have the permit already. And the work that you do has to be so significant that it renders the entire property uninhabitable for 30 consecutive days. So that's a big remodel. What if you say, I can't afford it, I don't need to do that big of a remodel, and I have no kids or grandkids or parents or spouse who's willing to move in? Well, then you can't get that tenant out. Forever. That tenant is there forever. You can keep increasing the rent by less than 10% a year, but that tenant has the right to stay forever. But by the way, tenants don't have these rights until they've been there 12 months. So what I tell landlords now is, you got your 20-year-old fourplex, so you're under this law, you have a vacancy, sign up the tenant to a 10-month lease, 11-month lease. So you got the commitment for 11 months, but after 11 months, the lease is over, you can kick them out. You don't need a reason. They don't get the rights until they've been there 12 months. So if you want to preserve because once you let a tenant there for 12 months, they're your tenant for life. Unless you come up with a kid to move them in, or you do a big remodel, or you're willing to take the property completely off the rental market for 2 years. Selling it doesn't change it. The buyer can't evict the tenant unless they have the same reason. So the point is, this is April 1st. The two new addendums to the 60-day notice are coming out next week. Question over here?
I was gonna say, I had a buyer investor client several years ago, and she did that up in San Francisco, took it off the market for 2 years because she didn't want it under.
Sometimes you gotta do that. I mean, and by the way, even if you do it the right way, you still gotta pay a month relocation or more.
So
it depends on what city you're in, it depends on how big the property is, minimum of a month.
So this guy rents for 11 months and doesn't move out.
As long as you give them the eviction notice before the 12-month, the fact that you can't physically get them out, you have the right to get them out.
What about cash for keys like they're doing in?
Yeah, I mean, the
LA
best
County?
way around this is simply bribing the tenant.
Well, but in LA County, the county sets what the tenant can ask the seller to give them, and it could be how long they've been there, it could be $100,000.
Everything I'm saying is not relevant in LA. Or because cities can be stricter.
Right.
I'm just talking about, but you know what's interesting about LA is the LA rent control law only applies to rental properties built before 78. So if I got a rental property that I have in LA, even though it's, of course, then the California law applies to rentals that are more than 15 years. So LA has 3 categories of rentals. Building built before 78, LA rule. Building built between 78 and 2009, California rule that I just talked about. Building built in the last 15 years, do whatever you want. Tenant who's been there less than 12 months, do whatever you want unless it's pre-78. I'm not expecting you to remember any of this.
Crazy.
I'm expecting you to think, if you are a property manager or you have your own tenants or you have clients who you're not managing the property for them, but they have tenants and they start asking you questions like, how do I evict or can I increase the rent? You're not going to answer the question. You're going to either tell them to get their own lawyer or you're going to call the legal hotline and say, here's my situation. I got a rental property in Fountain Valley, this many years old, tenant's been there this long, this many units, what can I do? Because it's so complicated now, no one can keep track of this. I can't keep track of it, I gotta go look it up all day. So that's the new thing. So those are the new forms for this month. Now let's talk about June forms. First of all, okay. There's a law coming out July 1st that says if you're selling a house that you've owned less than 18 months, you've got to provide more disclosures to the buyer. Okay, what if today you have a house that's 50 years old, sellers live there 30 years. You're selling it. Do you have to tell the buyer every repair that's been done on this house in the last 50 years? Of course not. The seller's only lived there 30 years. Well, does the seller have to disclose all the repairs they've done during the 30 years that they've owned it? Answer, only major repairs. I know what you're thinking, what's the difference between a major repair and a minor repair? Nobody knows. So, when in doubt, disclose. But here's the new law. The new law says effective July 1st, if you've owned the house that you're selling less than 18 months, you have to tell the buyer every single thing you've done during those 18 months. You don't ask yourself, is that a major thing or a minor thing? If you did anything to the house within the last 18 months, tell the buyer, and if it costs more than $500 and you used a contractor, you got to give them the contractor's contact information, and if you obtained a permit, you have to give them the permit or tell them where they can get the permit. So there's going to be a new question on the seller property questionnaire asking the seller, basically saying, if you lived in the house less than 18 months, do the following. Okay? So that's one change. Are there going to be any new forms coming out in June? At least 2. One is getting back to what we're talking about, the summit. There's going to be a commission advisory form, which is basically going to explain this stuff to your clients. Explain how commissions work now. I know what you're thinking. I'd like to get that form as soon as possible, but like I said, there's all these issues that are still being resolved. Once they are resolved, we will finalize this form and recommend that you give it to your clients. It won't be mandatory. Another new form that's coming out in June is called the balcony inspection disclosure. In case you didn't know this, there's a law in place right now that says every apartment building and every condo complex in California that has at least 3 units and has any exterior elevated elements. What does that mean? That means I look at that building, the fourplex, the apartment building, I look at the condo complex. Is there anything sticking out from the main building? Balcony, deck, staircase. I don't mean the balcony that's sort of enclosed. I mean, it sticks out from the main building. It's 6 feet off the ground. It's not decorative. People actually do stand on it. 6 feet off the ground, sticks out, people stand on it, and it's made of wood or wood-based materials. If that's the case, they have to be inspected by January 1st.
Does this apply to condos?
Condo building, condo complexes, and apartment buildings. So obviously what can happen is, you can imagine this, and by the way, if there's a problem, it must be fixed within 120 days. So I'm representing a buyer buying a condo in a complex of 150 units. Every single unit has a balcony that was made of wood or wood-based materials. So I buy the condo, and of course my HOA waits till the last minute, December 20th, and they inspect all 150 balconies, and the inspector says every single one of them needs to be replaced. And this costs $50,000 per balcony. What's gonna happen next? HOA does special assessment. Every buyer is gonna pay an extra $50,000. The buyer's gonna say to their agent, why did you tell me this could happen? Well, we did, because there's a new form coming out called the Balcony Inspection Disclosure, which you're gonna give to your buyers who are buying condos in buildings with stuff, or you're giving it to your buyers who are buying apartment buildings.
That's a good thing.
Who inspects? Who is the official inspector?
Yeah, very good question. The inspector, if it's a condo complex, has to be certain types of engineers or an architect. If it's a apartment building, it can be also certain types of contractors. The good news is, once this inspection is done, if it's a condo, it doesn't need to be re-inspected for 9 years. Apartment building, 6 years. So look for this coming in June. Okay, and there's gonna also be a new paragraph on the purchase contract talking about this. So new paragraph and new form.
So that's only for termites?
It's not for termites, it's for
Structural.
structural damage.
Yeah.
Structural damage. This is all based on what happened in Berkeley a couple of years ago, where they had a balcony, they had a deck, and it collapsed and killed 14 people. So that triggered this whole thing. All right.
That's a good thing.
It is a good thing. It's a safety thing. All right. What else is happening forms-wise? So the change to the seller property questionnaire. The buyer broker contract and the listing contract are obviously going to change because of this commission stuff. Have you noticed on the purchase contract paragraph 3 is that sort of that box, that grid, right? You noticed that, right? They're going to do that on the listing contract too. So the listing contract is going to have a box with all of the deal points, all the negotiable items in one place, as is the buyer broker contract. So balcony inspection thing, I got that. Also, other changes to the purchase contract. So balcony inspection is one thing. Second thing, you know how I said there's an insurance advisory form now? Well, there's also, in June, there's gonna be a new insurance contingency. Right now, on the purchase contract, there are 8 buyer contingencies. They're all listed right there. Buyer has 8 ways to get out of a deal. Loan, it didn't appraise, inspections, disclosures, pre-live, CC&Rs, solar lease, and I want to make my offer contingent on selling my house first. 8 ways out of a deal. In June, there's going to be a 9th way. My offer is contingent on getting insurance that I like.
I like it. Or that you can just.
In other words, buyers this is really going to force buyers to upfront in the deal investigate get a quote, figure out if insurance is available, and if so, how much it's gonna cost. Because sometimes it's gonna be so expensive, the buyer's gonna say, I can't really buy this house. As opposed to what happens today is buyers don't even look into it until they've removed their contingencies, and then it's a problem. So there are two things going on here to remind buyers to do this. Okay? One more change to the purchase contract is, by the way, guess what? These little changes are gonna make it a 17-page contract. Sorry, I have to tell you this. Also, you know on the last page of the contract, which is gonna be 17, now it's 16, where the agents sign it, it auto-fills with your name, address, phone number, and email. It auto-fills with that. So, right now there's a checkbox right under that, where if you check the box, the agent is saying to the other agent, that's the right email to send me stuff. By checking that box, you're saying to the other agent, if you send stuff to that email address, it is legally delivered as soon as you press send. You don't have to prove that I got it. I mean, there's an age-old problem, right? Is when you send an email to the other agent and they say, I never got it. I never got your amendment. I never got your contingency removal. You missed your deadline because I never got it. And you say, I sent it, so I don't know, I never got it. Which is why forever I've been saying, when you send an email to the other agent, make them respond and say, I got it. Make them acknowledge receipt. However, if that box is checked, you don't have to do that because they've told you if you send it here, it's good. So you don't have to worry about making sure they acknowledge receipt. If you send it to the place they send it, you're good. So what's going to change in June? It's going to be automatic. You don't have to worry about if the agent checks that box or not. It's automatically agreed unless they say otherwise, unless they opt out of that. It's automatic that if you send a document to the other agent to the email address that appears on the contract, it is considered delivered as soon as you press send. You do not have to prove that they got it. There's a box to, there'll be a box to opt out. There'll be a box to opt out. Okay, one more thing.
Oh my God.
I could go on for hours. I'm just giving you the highlight. Good. I'm ending up with the only good news I have for you today, and that is, have you noticed on the NHD report, there's now a yes or no box? On the signature page of the NHD report, there's a yes or no box, which simplifies your life in one small area. What I'm talking about is every listing you have to figure out if your property's in a very high or high fire zone. Because if it is, you got to give the buyer the fire hardening defensible space form. Up until this happened, it was not always a simple process to figure out if your listing was in a high or very high. You could go online, you could talk to your nice rep, she was standing right there, and she would help you. And she's very good, she would help you, but the point is now, is a simple yes or no box. So, in other words, you don't have to go online or ask her or have her investigate or whatever. By a quick glance at the NHD form, you're going to see yes is checked or no is checked. If yes is checked, you're in a high or very high fire zone. If no is checked, you're not. End of story, no further investigation. Simplifies your life in one small way. That is the only good news I have. There's a lot of stuff going on. I think actually, other than the commission stuff, there's not a lot of new bad things. Other than it's continually harder to be a landlord. Harder to evict people, harder to increase rent. But as you notice in the world of basic laws, there's not a lot of crazy new stuff. You got enough on your plate with this fundamental revolutionary change in commissions. Yes.
The commission advisory, so do we give that when we're on the listing side, buyer side?
You're probably going to give it to everybody. The form isn't out yet, and it's not going to be required. So the next thing you're going to see for us is Q&As on this stuff. One got posted today. It's on our website. It's called like Q&A about the settlement. There's gonna be a new Q&A coming out probably in a week saying Q&A on the new rules that are coming in July. I would encourage you to give these to your current clients unless we come up with some other form to do that, just so they don't say, you should have told me this was gonna change in July, it would have affected my behavior today. Other than that, you're gonna have to wait probably till June for the updated buyer broker contract, the updated listing contract, and we have to really figure out the things that need to be resolved, like the whole open house thing, and the whole, what do I do with current transactions? As I mentioned, there are issues that have not been resolved. And until they get resolved, we can't really give you definite answers. So we're gonna have a definite, that's why the Q&A I just mentioned may not come out for a few weeks, because we don't have all the answers yet. But the big things you can count on are buyer broker contracts, you're gonna have to have them signed. MLS offers of compensation are going away, which means as a buyer's agent, it's gonna be a more complicated process to make sure you get paid. You're either gonna need the listing agent to sign a CBC paying you, or the seller is gonna have to sign the purchase contract, paragraph 3G3 paying you, or if neither of those works, your own buyer is gonna cut you a check. And the other thing that needs to really to be resolved is, how is the lending industry gonna deal with this? And how are FHA and VA gonna deal with this? Because that's the real problem. They haven't figured out how this is bad, this is not good for buyers. This is bad for buyers, in my opinion. I mean, it takes away their representation. Everyone, they think, oh, it's gonna cut, sales prices are gonna be less. We'll see. I think the agents should get paid as much as you always get paid, if not more. We'll see how it plays out. Call the hotline if you have questions. I think the last 4 days have been the 4 busiest days of my life. I have been answering phone calls and responding to emails till midnight the last 3 nights. Tonight I will be responding to emails until midnight, or whenever I can stay awake till, and I'll be doing that for the next month or so. This will be the busiest month of my life. Fortunately, I like doing this. I love talking to you guys.
We like you.
Yeah, thank you. And that took a whole extra hour, so it's been real. Thank you very much.
Thank you.